Hello and welcome to Adweek Together, our daily live show on adweek.com, LinkedIn, Facebook, and YouTube. Today we are joined by Kieran Mathew. He's the founder and CEO of Amplify. Thanks for joining us today, Kieran.
Thanks so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be chatting today.
So today we're here to talk about the research that Kieran's company just did regarding Gen Z and the coronavirus. We had an episode of the Gen ZEOs Podcast yesterday come out where we discussed all of this in depth. And we're going to talk a little bit about some of the topics we touch on in the podcast. But if you want to hear the full thing and everything in depth, you can check it out on the podcast in addition to the things that we're talking about today. So to start off, Kieran, so what is this research? Why did you guys do it? And how did it come about?
Absolutely. So at high level, our business has changed drastically in the past 4 weeks, as have many small businesses in North America. So we wanted to kind of understand who our target consumers are right now, given that's actually drastically changed in the last 4 weeks, but also how we can adapt by deeper consumer understanding and how we can help our clients adapt by providing them with really actionable data. So that was the core piece. The secondary element that inspired this research was basically a lot of flawed coverage on how Gen Z was reacting and adapting to the COVID crisis. So a lot of what we saw early on were basically profiles on the spring breakers. And that was such a flawed discourse, only because, well, for a few reasons. But firstly, only about 40% of Gen Z consumers are attending universities or colleges in the US. So that's a much smaller sample size than one would need in order to get a reasonable understanding of what's happening in this market. Secondly, the majority of those students actually didn't have the money to attend a kind of spring break trip. So that reduces the sample size further. And then beyond that, of course, not all of those who had purchased spring break trips actually attended those and then celebrated. So it was a very flawed way of looking at Gen Z behavior. And I wanted to figure out a more accurate way to depict what was happening in this segment so that both advertisers and consumers and parents and just general people across North America actually understood what was happening in this market. I mean, the spring break thing is kind of like me going to a very wealthy neighborhood and asking those homeowners if they're feeling the effects of the COVID crisis, and then deducing that no Americans are having financial problems as a result of the crisis. So I wanted to figure out a better story to tell right now, given there's a lot of wonderful things and initiatives that Gen Z consumers are doing, but they're also feeling the effects of this crisis as much as anybody, and even more in many cases, given they've had to leave school, they've had to move back home, they've had to miss out on tons of social events like graduation, sports, etc. And they're just simply trying to learn a new way of life within their home. So those are the two kind of reasons as to why we did the study.
What were like the demographics of the study, and what did you guys find out about Gen Z, just overall right now, the state of Gen Z when it comes to like a health and mental health and employment perspective?
Absolutely. So the demographics, it was a Canadian-centric study. That being said, having done a lot of research on Gen Z in Canada and Gen Z in the US, the two demographics and cohorts are very much in alignment. So it was pretty much equal in terms of female and male representation. We also had representation from every province in Canada. The majority of our respondents were in the university/college segment, though we also were able to survey some in high school and some that are kind of considered young professionals right now. So some of the high-level key findings are that 22% of Gen Z consumers have been laid off now. This is in part a function of the significant majority of these consumers working in kind of the retail and service industry, which of course have been the most affected during this crisis. Secondly, increased anxiety and depression levels are very prevalent at 17 and 22% respectively, which is sad to hear. And I'm hoping brands and health professionals find ways to help those consumers adapt within their homes. And secondly, or thirdly, I should say, 55% of Gen Zers have said that this crisis motivated them to become more involved in their communities, which is pretty wonderful. We also think that's a function of them kind of being restricted to their homes and feeling like they cannot make an impact right now as a result. So those are kind of the high level findings. Some of the other things that we'll discuss are basically Gen Z is very future focused. As we know, they kind of matured during the 2008 financial crisis and saw and felt the effects that had on their families and on the community at large. So they were already very practical when it came to education, as well as skills training to make themselves as employable as possible. But we're seeing that fear is being amplified right now as a result of the increased unemployment levels. So a lot of these consumers are spending time learning new skills, and I'm sure we'll touch on that a little bit deeper later on.
So as you mentioned, this is a very wide-ranging study you guys did. You covered a lot of things from, like you said, employment and mental health, but also things like receptivity to advertising, how they're, spending time and money online, what else they're spending time doing. One of the things I did want to ask you about is currently, how are they spending their time? So without jobs, like you said, a lot of them have lost their jobs. There's obvious things like watching Netflix or, trying to get in some physical activity when they can. But there was one, surprising statistic you saw about how a good majority of them are spending their time improving themselves, right? So do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Absolutely. So both males and females are kind of doing the classic things of watching Netflix, TV, working out, walking, and spending time with family. One of the interesting notes there is that the time spent on watching TV has increased. As we know, this is kind of the streaming generation that's more focused on Hulu, Netflix, Disney Plus, and all the other platforms out there now. But as a function of being within their homes and being influenced by older demographics, they are actually spending time watching TV, watching the news, and kind of watching whatever their parents want them to watch in many cases. So that's a bit of background. The most important thing here is that 76% of Gen Z consumers are using this time to learn new skills, and that could be for personal or professional development. So there's some wonderful quotes, which you'll see on the screen here, but one of them is that since I cannot go for my summer internship, I'll be learning employable skills throughout the summer. I'm learning to code, etc. So there's a lot of people which are using this time to basically make themselves more employable, but also just make themselves more effective as individuals. And that could be from a cooking standpoint, physical activity, etc. On that end of physical activity, we are seeing decreased activity during this time. And of course, that's as a result of many people being confined to their homes. That likely has an effect on the increased levels of anxiety and depression. So that could be an opportunity for brands to find a way to encourage their community and their customers to be active within their homes, perhaps creating some kind of interactive challenge which brings people together.
Seems like we might have lost Kieran for a second. Let me cut to a quick break and see if we can get him back, and we'll be right back. All right, so we are back after a short break. That's just the nature of doing these live streams, especially when you're all the way in Canada and I'm in New York.
Yeah, it's the first time my computer has frozen before, and what a time to do it. So glad to be back and looking forward to continuing the conversation. I think we were discussing a little bit about their kind of time spent right now.
Yeah.
And just to wrap up that point, at high level, they are using this time to learn new skills. The time spent learning new skills will increase once their school years wrap up, which is an opportunity for digital companies and e-learning businesses to ultimately increase their market share and step up and really add value to these consumers' lives. So I expect that space to continue growing and thriving throughout the summer, especially if these physical distancing measures are continuing to remain in place.
You know, another way that they're spending their time, obviously, unsurprisingly, is online shopping. And you did a lot of research around, you know, what are they shopping for, who's shopping more, who's shopping less, both compared to male and female, and, you know, what were their shopping habits before compared to now. So what did you guys learn about, you know, Gen Z shopping online right now?
Absolutely. So firstly, it is clear that their shopping habits have changed significantly in the past 4 weeks. Females are spending net less online than before, while males are spending more than before. However, females are actually shopping online more frequently. So at high level, they are purchasing more often, but the total volume or the total dollars spent is actually decreasing, whereas males are shopping slightly less than once a week, but are spending net more. In terms of what they're actually spending their money on right now, the female respondents noted that they were spending a lot on clothing. Anecdotally, we saw that a lot of these consumers are not buying fancy dresses or jeans right now, but very comfortable kind of sweatsuits to wear around the house, which makes a ton of sense. And also creative things that they can do in their homes, like tie-dyeing sweatsuits. I know I've had a few friends do that recently, and it's becoming kind of a prevalent DIY activity for females right now in particular. Males were actually reporting spending a lot of money on books as well as digital learning tools right now, which is pretty fascinating and also reconciled with the fact that the significant portion of these consumers are using this time to upskill. And then secondary would be in-home entertainment as well as fitness-related kind of accessories that can be used within their home. So just makes a ton of sense that they're looking for ways to stay happy and engaged and for activities to do while they're kind of stuck at home.
I want to remind the audience that we are streaming this live on LinkedIn, and I'm keeping an eye on all of your comments. So if you have any comments or questions for myself or for Kieran, feel free to drop them there, and I will pick out a few at the end if we have some time. With that said, a lot of our audience is, you know, marketers and advertisers. So the question at the top of a lot of their minds right now is, you know, how can we reach Gen Z right now? Do they want to be advertised to? Do they want brands to communicate with them, both to help and from a marketing perspective? So what did you guys learn about Gen Z's receptivity to advertising during this time?
Absolutely. So 52% of Gen Z consumers approve of kind of being advertised to during this crisis. 27% do not approve of this, and then 21% are unsure. So the majority are open to being kind of advertised to in some capacity. That being said, the ways and the mediums in which advertisers and brands engage these consumers must change. So some of the interesting kind of anecdotes we saw is that people feel that advertising is okay because they know small businesses need to survive, and that they know in order for small businesses to survive, they have to spend money on advertising. So that's kind of what you'll see in the first quote on the left-hand side of the yes there. And then secondly, one of the interesting points here is that Gen Z corporations, Gen Z consumers are actually more trusting of corporations than the government to help fix challenges that are caused by COVID. And that actually wasn't in our study. That was in another interesting study from a group called Do Something Strategic. So that's pretty fascinating, but it does mean that those that are receptive to advertising are looking for practical solutions that will benefit their communities. Given the Gen Z's two top concerns right now are basically their family and friends' health, and then secondary would be kind of financial as well as community at large. So any ways to add value to the community is going to be particularly effective. At a high level, I think brands should think about this in three ways. So the anecdote that I like to use is basically when somebody is drowning, you aren't going to sell them on a course on how to swim. You're going to throw them a rope. You're going to bring them to shore. You're going to make sure they feel warm and safe on shore. And then ultimately, you're going to get them home safely. So that's kind of how brands should think about this right now. A great example of that would be Aritzia, the clothing retailer. So they released a comprehensive strategy as to how they were supporting their employees, their suppliers, and the community at large during this time. They, of course, felt significant impacts of this crisis, having to shut down all of their retail stores. But once they detailed that report in a manner that was kind of simple and engaging, it led all of their retail employees to share it out, to engage their networks. And ultimately, it was incredibly well received by the public. One of the things that we're seeing is that Gen Z consumers, the best way to engage them right now is actually by treating your employees and your community well. The way I like to see this is that Gen Z consumers have what I would like to call the best BS sectors out there. So if a brand sends out an email to their mailing list right now and says, we're committed to supporting our customers and the community at large, but then in the background, they're actually laying off all of their employees or acting in a way which is kind of not reconciled or not in alignment with that, then Gen Z will find out and they will not support that brand. So it's important to add value to consumers right now, and also to add value to your employees and the community at large. If you build an effective plan to do so, that will be your marketing, and that will have a tremendous impact on how Gen Z consumers are receiving your brand, both now and in the future. It's something that I truly believe they will not forget, and that will ultimately help you build loyalty with these consumers down the road. So those are kind of the two key pieces. The second piece is that Gen Z is really looking for ways to remain connected and engaged right now, given a lot of them are kind of feeling lonely within the confines of their home. The other thing that brands should consider as a subset of that is all of the experiences that these consumers have missed out as a result of this crisis. So think of sports games, think of graduating students in high school and graduating students in university that are missing out on all of their kind of cap and gown ceremonies, and find unique ways to help them kind of experience the emotions that would be derived from those experiences themselves in their home. So that actually could look like a brand creating a big grad bash on digital, getting some artists involved, sending out kind of fun packages to some of the people that tune in, and just creating a fun experience which inspires engagement amongst peers and sharing, but also something with the goal of inciting those emotions which they experience during a cap and gown ceremony, for example, within their home. So that's a really wonderful opportunity. And on that end, if you're creating virtual events or experiences right now, it's a great time to do so. That's a function of talent being very accessible as a result of being less busy. Which means you can probably engage top influencers. You can probably engage artists that you might not otherwise be able to. And it's probably not going to break your bank, especially if you're able to articulate to them that you're genuinely trying to make an impact with this versus trying to sell your product. So that's my kind of high level thoughts on how Gen Z is receiving advertising and the opportunities at hand, but definitely prioritize treating your people and employees well, because once you do, if you actually do that first and then transmit sales messaging to their audience, to your audience, they will listen. And again, kind of reflecting back to that Aritzia example, they started with treating their employees and their community well, and then they encouraged all of their employees to actually share out some of their favorite Aritzia outfits that they're wearing in home. And as a result, they're seeing tremendous engagement on social, and I'm sure they're seeing kind of tremendous purchasing on e-commerce just because they thought of value first, and then ultimately they were able to actually get some of their products out there.
So that's kind of what they're thinking right now and how they're responding to advertising right now. How about their mindset changes in the future? And this is the last thing I want to talk about: is how can marketers prepare to connect with them in the future? How is this changing their outlook on the future? And how are they planning to assimilate back into some sense of normalcy when all these orders are lifted?
Absolutely. So I want to preface this by saying it is hard for Gen Z consumers and for myself to understand how this is going to impact their behavior long term, simply because it's been 4 weeks. And of course, historically, major events like a world war or a pandemic have lasted for years in many cases, which has a tremendous impact on consumer behavior. It's unclear how much 4 weeks, or now probably more, are going to impact their behavior. But I'd love to make some kind of hypothesis as to how what's going to be the case, and to cite some kind of anecdotes from our research. So what we're seeing right now is that they're going to definitely spend less time in crowds right after, as well as kind of focus on maintaining really strong hygiene habits, and ultimately building secondary sources of income. So as we discussed earlier, this crisis has amplified their kind of financial insecurities, as well as that drive to have a great career, and to kind of become financially stable. So what we're seeing, kind of like the quotes in this slide right here, is that people are looking for ways to build a secondary stream of income, and also, of course, to upskill so that they can become more employable. They're going to avoid crowds, which ultimately is going to have an effect on any corporations or experiential marketing companies which are trying to bring people together. Once this crisis is resolved, if you're working to engage Gen Z, I would focus on finding unique ways to create more intimate experiences, maybe local community experiences versus mass events, which actually might not be as well received in the short term. Of course, at some point, people are going to get back to sporting games. People are going to start getting back to concerts and festivals and bars, but it might take a little bit more time than one would expect. So those are kind of the key things that we highlighted in the study, and those are the key things which I expect to be affected even if the crisis is resolved, and social distancing measures are removed in the next kind of 10 days to 2 weeks.
Kieran, I wanted to thank you for joining me today and sharing all this great information with us. As I mentioned at the top of the show, we discussed this on the Gen ZEOs podcast. The episode came out yesterday. It's available at adweek.com/Gen ZEOs, GENZEOS, or all the major podcast listening platforms. Thanks again, Kieran, for coming on the show today and sharing it with us.
Thanks, Nick. It was a pleasure chatting.
As for Monday's show is going to be our executive editor, Stephanie Patrick, and she will be joined by Ian Zelaya, Adweek reporter, and they're going to talk about the future of experiential marketing. So come prepared Monday with good questions, and it's going to be a great topic on Monday. As for right now, thank you everyone for tuning in today, and have a great weekend. Thanks.